Good morning, good afternoon, or maybe good evening, depending on where you are. I'm Bob McConnell, co-founder of the U.S. Ukraine Foundation and Director of External Relations for our Friends of Ukraine Network, FOUN. Welcome to our discussion. So where are we after the so-called Alaska Summit and the Washington meetings yesterday? This morning, we have four of our FOUN experts to share their thoughts on what has happened and the ramifications going forward. John Herbst, Ambassador Herbst, is not on yet. He's in very heavy demand and is finishing up an interview. He's the former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine and head of the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. Debra Cagan, former State Department and Defense Department official and senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Ambassador Dan Fried, former Assistant Secretary of State for Europe, former U.S. Ambassador to Poland and Distinguished Fellow at the Atlantic Council. And Herman Pirchner, President of the American Foreign Policy Council. It's been a packed week or so of activity with the meeting between Presidents Trump and Putin in Alaska, international communications between Trump and European leaders, including Ukrainian President Zelensky, and then the meetings here in Washington throughout the day yesterday. Going into Alaska's meeting, we were told President Trump wanted a ceasefire from Putin or there would be dire consequences. There was no ceasefire. Indeed, Russia's assaults on Ukrainian citizens and infrastructure haven't even slowed down. And to date, there have been no consequences for Russia. Indeed, with rare exceptions, I believe it is fair to say that criticism directed at President Trump was the main thing that came out of Alaska. But it appears on this side, Europe and the United States, there seems to be comfort and maybe more after yesterday's meetings, although there are inconsistencies between what President Trump said regarding Russia and what is coming out of the Kremlin. So, a lot to talk about. John, where are we?
Where are we? Yesterday was the latest turn of the Trump merry-go-round. And yesterday's turn was a good one, which largely, but not entirely, offsets, I would say, the dual turn of the decision on August 7 or 8 to not keep Trump's line in the sand. In other words, to allow Putin to go past August 8 without sanctions, even as he continues to bomb the hell out of Ukraine. And then the treatment at Anchorage, which taken by itself was clearly a step in the wrong direction and confirmed Putin's view that he can prevent Trump from putting any pressure on Russia. Yesterday, to my stamp, from my point of view, was a large, albeit still not quite precise, positive. The description, the focus on security guarantees, Article 5-like security guarantees, that could be great, although obviously how you define those guarantees are critical, and they may turn out to be not so Article 5-like. But that's a step in a very large step in the right direction. Trump saying he will be part of it, a very large step in the right direction. And just to make a point, which is self-serving, I remember telling many people, even before the inauguration, that the idea coming from Trump world that security could be provided to prevent future Russian aggression by the combination of arms and peacekeepers, European troops, and saying that it's easy for Trump to agree to intel and logistics, including equipment. The real kicker is what we do when the Russians start shooting at the peacekeepers. And what Trump was saying essentially was, I'm considering that. So to me, that's a big deal. But having said that, and Debra, I'm sure, will join in on reasons why we should be skeptical. Well, actually, before I get to that, security guarantees is the headline yesterday. The second point below that is the focus on first the Putin Zelensky bilateral and then throw Trump in for a trilateral. We saw what I'm sure you all saw the Ushakov statement, which dumped both on troops of NATO countries in Ukraine and didn't dump on the idea of a Putin Zelensky bilateral, merely sidestepped it by saying, not quite correct. Actually, I suppose you could say this is not false, that the US and Russia agreed that the level of negotiators between Ukraine and Russia needs to be higher, but perhaps not so high as to include the dictator, which of course is the whole point. So again, it's a good day, but who knows where Trump goes tomorrow? And someone just mentioned to me a statement that Trump made this morning on Fox, which I did not see, and I had to find out what that is. So that's where we are, and I'm sure Dan and Debra and Herman all have their views on this too.
Well, Debra, you've been referred to a couple of times. What's your take?
I haven't heard Trump's statement yet either. I think, look, I think what happened yesterday was extremely promising if you're a European, which is that they bulletproofed Zelensky. They did that intentionally. I thought it was brilliant. And I've been saying for a while now, be careful what you wish for, because Trump kept pushing, castigating the Europeans, telling them they're not doing enough, they're incompetent, they can't do anything, they're lousy allies, we might not protect you in the case of war, we don't want you in the Pacific because you're incompetent, et cetera, et cetera. And now the result of that has been the Europeans have actually stood up in large numbers. The countries represented yesterday were only a small part of this coalition for Ukraine. There's a number of other countries who are extremely active in this. And for the first time, if you look at the amount of assistance given to Ukraine, Europe has now far surpassed US assistance by several billion euros. And Europe is giving them not just emptying out stocks, Europe is giving them new stocks and producing new things for them to use. Germany leads that, which is also really, I think, is a reflection of the change from Schultz to Merz, which I think is excellent. So on the good news side, I think Trump is shocked a little bit that Europe stood up so quickly and so strong, and that Europe's defense industry is running at light speed. And I think they were showing their adamance about defending Ukraine because they see that as part of their own territory being attacked. So I don't know what you just put up here, Bob, because I can't read.
Well, there's been several references to Zelensky being bulletproof and so forth. This is this morning's cartoon from Mike Ramirez showing Zelensky coming in with all the people around, and one says, Zelensky has a big security detail, and the other guy says, no, those are the European leaders. I thought it would really captured that quite well.
So I think that's really positive, and I think this is not something that I would wager that no one in this administration thought this would happen and this would happen at such light speed. And I'm looking at Dan because he knows that we've both dealt with Europe that doesn't move very quickly. And this is a huge sea change. It's been a while in coming, but it's there. And I think it's extremely promising. And I have to say, I was very pleased with Chancellor Merz when Trump kept poo-pooing ceasefires and said, no, we need a ceasefire. And he was very direct. And I frankly don't think Trump or the people around him were expecting that. Now, the other piece to this is moving extremely fast. I'm not just talking about a trilateral, but the Europeans and if people have been tasked in the US without going into a lot of detail to start moving out smartly and looking at the contours of what this will take and how it will happen. The caution I put here is twofold. One, and Dan and I talked about this yesterday, as did John and I. Those of us who've been involved in international treaty and agreement negotiations understand that those kind of negotiations frequently have different statuses. And so when we talk security guarantees, even though that word guarantee, as you know, Bob, you're a lawyer, has a legal connotation, and things don't necessarily have to be approved by 2/3 of the Senate, like some treaties do. But this is an issue of the old saying of will versus shall. And so if I'm a European and I want a backstop, if I'm Zelensky and I want a backstop, I want the words coming out of the President Trump's mouth to say shall, not will. And I want that because I want to make sure this has this, as I like to say, it has the staying power beyond what most of my Chicago sports teams have, which isn't very long. So, that the sports analogy was for John. So, so that's what I want to see. So I think the next part of this is to work out the contours of that. The Europeans and the Ukrainians already have a pretty good idea of what that will entail. But the last point I'll make here, because I've prattled on too long, is one of the things that I found incredibly disturbing was on Sunday when Witkoff went on CNN and he described, and it hurt me as an American to hear this. He said, and I quote, I'm paraphrasing, but he said that President Putin is allowing us to do security guarantees. And my reaction to that was, does anyone miss the point that we're the biggest, you know what, on the street, and we are the superpower, and we were going to ask Putin's permission to defend our allies and our friends? And that was beyond my comprehension. And I'm concerned that that is still something in the heads of some people in this administration. I can't say it's in the head of the president. I just don't know. The president's not speaking to Debra Cagan, but it is the fact that that was said is beyond my comprehension, that any American would think they need President Putin's permission to have security guarantees to defend their friends and allies.
Deborah, as always, is so good, and I'm glad you brought up the Witkoff thing. I mean, I just can't believe he's who we have going to see Putin or anybody else, but that's my view. Dan, last Thursday in our pre-Trump Putin meeting webinar, you expressed, I think this is accurate, very guarded hope for a good outcome. And then we had, I got to believe, that dipped a bit on Saturday. Where are we now?
Well, Anchorage was not good, and I could use stronger language. Trump caved on his own positions that he had expressed, literally flying to Anchorage, and then he caved. It was a bad show. I think we partly recouped that. In fact, we largely recouped that yesterday. Look, I'm in substantial agreement with what John and Debra said. Okay, so I'm not going to repeat it. There are two issues that frame an eventual settlement. One is territory, and the other is security. Security is the most important because without it, territory doesn't matter, because Putin will just start the war again and take more territory. Witkoff said that the Russians agreed to Article 5-like guarantees. I'll bet you dollars to rubles they did no such thing. My guess is that Putin said he loves security guarantees, so much so that Russia will be part of them. And, at this point, right, experienced hands know what that means. There'll be, the Russians will propose a council of the guarantors for Ukraine.
I'm sorry,
of course,
Dan. I'm sorry, Dan. Just one interruption. All I could think flash before my mind was Transnistria and South Ossetia. That I just want to say
of
that.
course. Look, Bob, don't send me in to do a complicated real estate deal. All right. You won't be satisfied with the results because I will miss things that an experienced real estate hand will catch. You see where I'm headed with this? We need, Deborah's point is spot on. We do not need Russia's permission. and should not ask for Russia's permission to provide security for Ukraine. The Russians will object. In fact, the Russians, MFA, has already issued a statement today saying, no way are NATO member countries going to put forces into Ukraine. We shouldn't ask their bloody permission. The framework for security for Ukraine is coming into view. It involves the coalition of the willing in front, but with serious U.S. backup, not boots on the ground. I'm not an expert. I defer to Debra, and if she disagrees with me, she's right and I'm wrong. Let's just stipulate that. But defense of Ukraine should mean air power. I'm far more confident of our ability to help Ukraine's security than I was 15 years ago, because Ukraine has defended itself just about on its own, with our weapons, but not our involvement. If you had European air defense and European and U.S. air cover over Ukraine, that might make a critical difference, plus arms, plus defense industry cooperation. This could work. Again, cue the military person, General Breedlove, others who know what they're talking. Debra, people who know this should put it together. But this is it's possible that this could work. The second issue is territory, and I much prefer a provisional line, an armistice line, like the line between East Germany and West Germany, or the Korean armistice line, to something permanent. But I did notice that Alexander Stubb, the president of Finland, in the meeting in the White House yesterday, referred to Finland's experience in the Winter War. Finland gave up its second largest city of Viborg and a lot of territory, but it saved the country. The Finns are proud of themselves for having saved their country. It was not a just peace, but Finland is free. And the Finns made the right choice. I'm not saying the Ukrainians should make the same choice, but Stubb referred to it. So, but none of that matters unless there's security for Ukraine. And Trump will have to stare down Putin to get there. Putin will say no. He'll say that there can be outside peace observers from the UN or some such. No deal. We need to take Ukraine's security seriously, and we need not to abandon our leverage. Final point. I was astonished that Secretary of State Rubio, who's a smart man, said on the Sunday talk shows that we shouldn't impose economic pressure on Ukraine because it'll hurt diplomacy. What? Economic pressure on Ukraine is what helps diplomacy. And people like Marco Rubio used to understand that. Fatuous hopes are not going to impress the Kremlin. What is he talking about? Of course we should put more economic pressure on Russia, and we should make clear our readiness to do so rather than our reluctance. So that was, unfortunate is too mild a way to put it. But we may find ourselves in the position where we have to lean on Putin to stop the nonsense. And we have plenty of viable options for putting more economic pressure on Russia. And I suspect we will need them. Sorry to go on, but it's been quite a couple of days.
Thank you, Dan. And the reference you made, the security guarantees, and President Zelensky said they're trying to work out what those will be over the next 10 days and so forth. I do remind that the Friends of Ukraine Network this year, February, came out with a booklet that every member of Congress has been sent, and we've got it elsewhere, on what enforcing a ceasefire or a peace agreement would require. And it's already been mentioned, air power is critical to that. Herman, you've been listening. I welcome your thoughts, and also it'd be hard given that Congress is in recess and so forth, but you always have your ear to the ground on Capitol Hill. If there's anybody up there that you can listen to, I'd like to hear what you might have heard from members of Congress and so forth, but don't limit yourself to that.
Well, I'm not going to prejudge what members of Congress will be saying over the next few days, but it's clear that there's substantial bipartisan support in Congress for Ukraine, and that the mood is certainly in favor of increased pressure on Russia. And that can be a given. What's not a given is what Putin's going to do. And I think when you look at what's changed inside of Russia, you can argue that maybe Putin will not stop the war. And if he does not stop the war, what will he be dealing with, and what will we have to deal with? In the early parts of the war, he was very careful to use canned meat from ethnic regions, from the poor regions of Russia, so as not to cause undue trouble in St. Petersburg and Moscow. Now you're having drones going into Moscow, which are disrupting the effects of the schedules of the elite, and they're not happy about not being able to take their planes on time, having flights canceled. You're having severe economic problems in Russia, and even some talk that the Russian government is going to have to start confiscating corporate and individual bank accounts to continue to pay for the war effort. Their rainy day fund, which has been funding up to about a third of the Russian budget, is running out. So how we continue to pay for that if he doesn't confiscate funds in existing accounts? One option is China, and one thing I would watch for, will China choose to get more involved by underpinning the finances of Russia, or will they stay to the side and let pressure build on Russia to reach some agreement? So more questions than answers, but I'll stop there.
Well, thank you. One thing that I've talked about last week and previous things, and that the foundation has talked about now for a number of years, is the abducted children. And obviously, we all know that the First Lady wrote a letter, not referring specifically to Ukrainian children, but apparently President Trump delivered it to President Putin. And the subject certainly was part of yesterday. The abducted children is, that under the Genocide Convention, what Russia has been doing is genocide. Any thoughts on the fact that finally, in this meetings yesterday, the children were in fact a topic, and we apparently have indicated, or President Trump has indicated, that the United States is all in and trying to help sort all that out. Anybody got thoughts on that?
I was in Ukraine about 6 weeks ago, and if there's one topic that came up when you talked with non-government officials, average folks, it's the question of the children, and not just those that are sent to Russia, but those that are in occupied Ukraine, and those that might be in parts of Donbass that could be given up. If you want to get an emotional reaction for an average Ukrainian citizen, bring up the children.
Yeah. Right.
Look, it's a good
John?
thing. It's a good thing that this issue is raised at that level. One, it reminds the whole world, and especially those in the United States who might not be inclined to serve American interests by stopping Putin in Russia, what we're up against. It's also an issue, though, that conceivably the Kremlin could play the way they played the issue of Soviet Jewry back in the 70s, where they make concessions with that as a way to pick up some advantage here or there. Although it's a little bit harder because that would sort of acknowledge that they've actually kidnapped these kids. But they could put some new cover on it and make this a chit in the game.
Well, and I do think that Herman made a good point. It's not just the abducted children. There's an awful lot of children in the occupied territories, and there's a lot more in the not occupied territories that supposedly Mr. Putin wants to be given to him, so that he has all of Donbass, and how children there are being treated, and generally citizens would be treated. When we talk about the land swap, for lack of a better term. I think I'm being accurate, Friends of Ukraine Network have always wanted and felt that Ukraine could win the war if they had been given what they needed when they needed it. Now we're at a stage where apparently we need to be at least talking about some concessions relating to land. President Zelensky, I guess he has said, and Trump has said, that issue is to be left to Putin and to Zelensky. Thoughts on that? Thoughts on that, John?
First, I think that we should do more to raise consciousness, even within the administration, maybe first and foremost the administration, that there's right now a potentially dangerous inconsistency in our position. We are pushing hard, and this is great, for Article 5 like security guarantees involving, of course, the United States. But the land that Putin wants in Western Donbass is strategically significant. It's high ground. It's concentrated urban spaces, all of which makes it a wonderful defense line. So if we are contemplating security guarantees, which might involve our allies' troops in Ukraine, we're going to make it harder for them to defend Ukraine and themselves. And this point is, I think, worth highlighting. And in fact, I saw a great tweet on X this morning from Stub, or about Stub, praising him for telling Trump that this is like the Great Wall to keep the Huns out. And Trump apparently liked that metaphor a lot. And that drives home precisely the point I've just made. But no one is connected, again, how we could be creating a problem for our allies or ourselves down the road. And by the way, I think this is notable as a barometer on Trump world, that Jack Keane was arguing yesterday on Fox that there should be American troops in Ukraine. Yeah. Not a large number, he said, but there should be American troops in Ukraine.
So let me jump in here. John hit the nail on the head. Western Donbass is strategic. Excuse the analogy, but it's like the Golan Heights for Israel. That's the closest analogy I can come up with in sort of current parlance. And it's sort of like no one wants to give territory that allows your enemy to shoot down on you. Every cowboy Western movie, every Civil War piece, and you go around Washington, you look at all those forts that were built. They're all built on Arlington Ridge. They're built, looking over the Potomac, Fort Washington, So you don't want to give up territory that allows your enemy a strategic advantage from the get-go. And John is right that this is going to impair the Europeans' ability to do to hold the line. I don't want to say peacekeeping, because I think the blue hat situation went out the window with Srebrenica a long time ago, but this is peace enforcement. You cannot do peace enforcement if you're walking into something that already has you at a massive strategic disadvantage. And I think that's very clear. And I think that's what Stub was trying to say as well, that this allows Russia not to run, not to push, just to stroll into Ukraine and cause a lot more damage. That's the first thing. The second thing, going back to air power, I think when you look at air power here, decisions are going to have to be made on not just the Europeans, because I don't think there's anything wrong with the U.S. Sort of putting aircraft, putting in aircraft intelligence collectors, putting in aircraft in airfields in Poland and Romania and elsewhere, where they could patrol these issues and without crossing the borderline, if that's Trump's hangup, but they can still do patrols. John told me something the other night, which was really disturbing, that someone on Newsmax or Fox said that it was okay to give Russia Crimea because they deserve to control the Black Sea. And I was just laughing at this, because I don't think people understand the transit point from the East Med to the Black Sea and where the Danube River is. I've always said Americans can be both geographically and population ignorant. And I think people forget there are landlocked countries in Europe that still get US LNG, and it has to go someplace to get there. So it's almost like cutting off your own, we're gonna like drill, baby, drill, but we have to have a market for what you drill. And it isn't going to be just the US market, obviously. So I think this you have to look at the Black Sea. So this, and I know the British have been very good on this. We need to start, part of this has to be freedom of navigation patrols on a routine basis in the Black Sea, on top of the Kerch Strait. And the other part of it has to be air. And air could be standoff as well, because our air systems work well enough to tell you intelligence-wise what's going on without sitting there. And then the Europeans. I mean, you're not going to find an airfield in Ukraine that the Europeans are going to want to use for their aircraft necessarily. But there's a large number of Europeans that are in Romania right now. I mean, the French and Italians both have facilities in Romania. And there is a huge Romanian F-16 airfield that was built for training and the like. It legitimately can be a home to that. So I think building an air corridor is important. And that means not just drawing a line in the sand on the ground, because people confuse boots on the ground with other assets, meaning air and naval. And I think that's important. So going back to the Western Donbass, insanity to give that away, because it's like like I said, the analogy is the Golan Heights. And I used to joke with the Israelis after having had a glass of Golan Heights wine. I said, I hope you're keeping the heights for strategic reasons, because the wine isn't cutting it, you know? But but that's the point here. And then you can do quite a bit in terms of setting that up and the parameters of what you're looking at by having assets in the region that can do an air corridor, that can do a naval corridor.
Thank you, Deborah. It seems to me, well, Dan, go ahead.
Listening to Debra, I'm reminded of the negotiating principle that you should not accept your adversary's framework for the talks. Debra is talking about a line of contact or an armistice line or a boundary which makes sense in the long term, which is sustainable. Putin is going to insist on the administrative lines of the existing oblasts, the existing provinces, Donetsk and Luhansk. A frank conversation with the Russians would be, you don't get to dictate the terms because you haven't conquered these territories. And you crossed an international boundary in violation of your own damn treaty with the Ukrainians in the early part of the century that Putin himself agreed to. So if there's going to be a demarcation line, it's going to be a sustainable one. And if you don't like that, swallow what we're going to do with your oil revenues. That kind of frank talk is something the Russians understand. Look, John, Debra, and I have all dealt with the Soviets and the Russians. They know how not to negotiate forever. They also know how to negotiate when they want to. Okay? What George Kennan said in 1946 is still relevant. The Kremlin is impervious to the logic of reason, but highly sensitive to the logic of force, meaning lean on them and then have that as the basis for a conversation. What I liked about the meetings yesterday in the White House is that you could see the sketch of a sustainable settlement coming into view, but that's going to take us, it's going to require us to push the Russians into a more reasonable frame of mind, which requires pressure. So on the one hand, you hold open the possibility to the Russians that they will actually get something. They're going to keep, as a de facto matter, maybe not forever, but they're going to keep Crimea and large parts of Luhansk and Donetsk. But they're going to have to give up things. They're going to have to give up a lot of Zaporizhia. They're going to have to give up Kherson, and I hope all of it. And if they don't like that, we should put more pressure on them because their position on the battlefield is not all that great. The big breakthrough they made near Pokrovsk was an infiltration down a few kilometers that the Ukrainians have now taken care of. This was not what the Western press said, the final Russian breakthrough that collapses the Ukrainian defenses. We've been reading that story for 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
The point is that pressure on the Russians and the ability to negotiate can come together to create a deal. I think the Ukrainians would do it, but if in their place, I would not negotiate until I had a much better idea of the kind of security backing I would get. We're getting there, not there yet, but we may be getting there.
If I could jump in on Dan's point regarding pressure, there is you could call it a dilemma in Trump's approach to resolve this conflict. And I do believe he does want to achieve a durable peace. That's why I am not pessimistic about what he's doing, although there are issues. The only way to achieve a durable peace is to deal with the party obstructing a durable peace. And that party is the Kremlin. So President Trump's reluctance to put pressure on Moscow is in fact a way of stalling, blocking even his own efforts to achieve that peace. And this picks up on the point that Dan made early on, that it's odd that Secretary Rubio was saying, of course, we're not going to put sanctions on Russia because we want to enhance diplomacy. When in this case, the only way you will achieve the outcome you want is by making it clear to Putin that A, he will not conquer more of Ukraine, and B, he will be leading his economy to destruction if he continues the war. That's the way you use American power. And as Debra pointed out, we are the preeminent power, period, to achieve our diplomatic objective of a stable, durable peace.
Yeah. I think it's important to think about the internal political dimensions of all this. We're 6 months away from the height of the primary season, and the closer we get to that primary season, the more pressure the Trump administration will feel from those elements of the Republican Party that disagree with those of us on this call. So time is important, and if we can't begin to change minds there, it works against us to some degree.
Can I just say something? Herman, I agree with you, but I think there's another piece to this. All the MAGA people who say, oh, it's going to be World War III, buying into Putin's line, Tucker Carlson, oh, my good friend Vladimir, blah, blah, blah. I mean, I can't help but think there's a little bit of macho left in MAGA land. And if I'm a macho person, my reaction is going to be, this guy made my president look like a putz. And I don't like it when my president is made to look like a putz by some, authoritarian dictator who makes nothing but petroleum and petroleum byproducts, never made anything. And so I do think that this administration is playing this in some ways incorrectly because they're buying into this World War III thing. I do think Trump has some fear of this World War III thing because I think he forgets that, our systems actually work. And and there's a lot of evidence that the Russian strategic nuclear triad is in a cast and limping. And I would say that at some point, do you really want to look like a weenie on the world stage? And that too has to start playing. And I think Trump can take up the cudgels for that. It's one thing to try to beat up Greenland or something else like that. It's another thing to say that I'm a pretty tough guy and I know how to be tough with Putin, because I could see even his supporters are starting, they talk about World War III, but they're also talking about how the United States should not look weak and foolish against this guy. So I think that's, forgive me, I'm a Chicago street kid, and so I want to be the toughest person in the room. It's just my upbringing. But by the same token, I would think that the MAGA crowd would not want to walk around with their tail between their legs because we caved to someone who is much weaker than we are. And Herman, to go back to what you said initially, to sort of have a fear of what Russia's doing. When Russia, you talked about the people that they were using, that they were conscripting to fight this war. But now, in addition to North Koreans, they're also putting Cubans in there. They're paying Cubans money. They're paying people in Venezuela money to come fight their war. That's not the sign of a country that has a professional military that knows what it's doing.
I agree that you can make the case to the MAGNA people, but the question is, will Trump make the case? Will Vance make the case? Will other people that MAGNA voters listen to make the case? It's a winnable case, but I would be more comfortable if we had a larger volume of people making it.
Well, and I agree. Yes, Daniel.
John Herbst earlier referred to a statement Trump made on Fox News. The Washington Post has now published that, and it's relevant to this conversation. Trump said that U.S. would be involved in security guarantees for Ukraine. The Europeans would put troops on the ground. We would not put troops on the ground, but we would back them up by air because there's nobody that has the kind of stuff we have. So that strikes me as a plausible division of labor. The U.S. wouldn't put troops on the ground. It never occurred to me that we would. You could have intelligence there, other units, but you wouldn't have ground troops on the ground. U.S. Air, based in Romania, based in Poland, could do a hell of a lot. And if that's what Trump has in mind, that's pretty strong. Now, that's the good news. The bad news is Putin will have none of any of it. And that goes back to the need to stare them down. But I would put President Trump's remarks to Fox this morning on the good side of the ledger, especially if we mean it. Sorry to interrupt, but John had raised it, and it's a.
Well, I agree. I agree very much, Dan, and I'm glad you looked that up. You know, I think it was Debra that made a point, this is quite some time ago, about peace agreements that have always required to be successful America's participation. And I combine that with this is a new situation. Obviously, we're at a different time. But General Breedlove makes the point that we, the United States, the last time we lost a soldier on the ground to an enemy air fire was in April of 1953 in Korea. Since that time, we have always had air superiority when we've moved troops on the ground. We pushed a lot of things in Ukraine for them to go forward in ways we would never have gone forward. But if we're going to have air power available to cover, it is a big deal. And if Trump is getting there, it is a huge deal. I go back to other things that we've said. We're all waiting. We've all heard what happened in Washington. We're hearing the reports of what our people, meaning the Europeans and the United States, are saying. But we haven't heard much. What we have heard from the Kremlin is not quite jiving with our interpretation or Trump's interpretation of what Putin agreed to. We're all coming back to what is Russia going to do? What has it done? Is it delaying, or is it going to have to do things? Are we going to put the pressure on to make them do things they haven't wanted to do in the past?
Let me jump in here. I think that this goes back to, forgive me if I'm offending anyone of the male persuasion, but are you a man or a mouse? And this really goes back to that. It goes back to Donald Trump. Are you a man or a mouse? Are you going to stand up and be the superpower president that you were elected and you're supposed to be, of the number one greatest power, greatest country on the face of the earth? Or are you going to let this third-rate, petroleum producing dictator tell you what you can and cannot do. And I think at some point you just have to, be the macho guy and just say, this is what we're going to do. And I think the other piece to this, Dan, is not just air power and that sort of thing. I'm willing to bet that one of the things that's out there is UCOM, slash SACUR, going to be coordinating for command and control, communications, and all of those elements, and fusing because Wiesbaden is still open, it's up and running, the coalition's still active there. And I think that, for my part, any role that General Gronkiewicz plays here is going to be very positive, because that allows you to fuse intelligence, fuse operations, fuse every ISR, everything that you need to do to prosecute this. And that, to me, is worth its weight in gold when you're doing an operation like this. So it's not just air power, but I'm sure he's a very smart guy. The chairman, General Kane, has made this clear to the president of, this is what we do, without a boot on the ground. You can do all of this. And so I think that's important. But going back to this thing, it really comes down to whether the president of the United States is going to be a man or a mouse. Is he going to walk? He's already trying to talk the talk. Let's see him walk the walk and just say, you, Vlad, thank you very much. Appreciate your opinion, but I don't have to listen to you. And, you're not the one necessarily in charge here. You want me to be involved? Well, I'm the superpower. That's why you want me involved. I mean, whether Trump believes it's because of him personally, who cares? I just don't care. But it comes down to, are you going to say, this is what this is going to be? You don't get to dictate to us what you want, and then you're going to get it as a fait accompli. That's not the way this is going to work. And it's not the way it's worked in any operation in which the U.S. has been involved, even tangentially. And that's it. And you have to lay that groundwork out there and just say, no, you're not getting this. And as Dan said, you just have to learn how to say no. You can't be Witkoff and just keep saying yes to Putin. You can't do that. You have to say no, and that's not going to work for us.
Well, Debra, we have a couple of things in the chat box for the question and answer thing. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but there's a note talking about our laws saying that we cannot recognize or concede Crimea. I don't think anything I've heard said in a permanent way we would do that. Am I misunderstanding the discussions that maybe Russia continues to occupy for a while, but it would be not an understanding that it is their territory?
This is going to be one of the toughest issues. You hire diplomats to come up with the wording to protect the Ukrainians' equities and not give away territory permanently. There are lots of ways in which this can be done. Now, it may be that the Russians insist on a permanent, legal change of borders. The Ukrainians will resist. We should resist. I don't know how this gets resolved. I do know that the Ukrainians are not going to consider anything like that unless the Russians put something on the table other than demands. Trump talks of swaps. Swap means the Ukrainians get something, the Russians get something, and it's clear that the Russians are in no mood for anything like that. Their demands are maximal. So I don't want to say where this will end up, but right now the Russians are still demanding everything, and we shouldn't buy it. By far, the better outcome is a line of contact or an armistice line or a demarcation line. Call it whatever works, but don't give away the ultimate principle. Now, in the end, it doesn't matter what I say. The Ukrainians are going to have to make a decision. I don't know which one it'll be, but they're not going to make any decision based on Putin simply smirking and demanding everything, because that's where he is, and he's not going to fall off that until we push him hard.
And that really goes to Deborah's point. The president, or well, I guess it's not just Debra, the president has been talking the game far more clearly in the last few days. But now, is he going to assert pressure so that the squeeze comes to Putin and he understands we're going to use our power?
I think there's another point here. We started off when I started off talking about the Europeans. I think Putin miscalculated two critical points. One, he calculated that Trump could make an agreement and force Ukraine and the Europeans to buy off on it. And two, he underestimated the Europeans not necessarily agreeing with everything Trump wanted. So he thought that Trump had more power than he did, and he thought that the Europeans would back down, and he miscalculated on both points. And I think it's healthy for him to keep miscalculating that way. The point here on this, and Dan said it. Look, we never recognized the Baltic countries as being part of the Soviet Union. We never recognized, there's a reason why, as Dan pointed out earlier, in the Korean Peninsula, why there's still no peace, because of the 38th parallel. You can go down all of these different agreements. Even some of the mess in the Western Balkans is still there because we never agreed to recognize, permanent places like in Sarajevo, for example. So there's a long history of doing this in very good legal terms, that comply with the UN Charter as well. And I think it's interesting because this administration made a decision on Taiwan where they did not want to keep endorsing this one China policy that Democrats, Republicans have been doing for decades and decades. And, we're talking more about Taiwan being a separate entity to itself, not part of the one China policy. So they've kind of done this on Taiwan. And there's no reason why they couldn't take a similar stand on Ukraine.
I think, an awful lot of it goes back to, is President Trump going to assert genuine power? And I suspect we're going to have to see whether that's going to happen in the fairly near future. If what we are getting out of the Kremlin so far are kind of slightly different interpretations of what they agreed to, and if President Trump wants to make them live up to what he understands they lived up to, he's going to have to, those consequences that didn't come out of Alaska are going to need to come out of Washington's meetings, it would seem to me. John, isn't that accurate?
I agree with that, but I think your timeline is too short. I think that we are on a merry-go-round. There's going to be many spins, and then finally, there's a better than 50% chance, but I'm not saying it's a 80% chance that we will get to the right point where Trump realized that in order to get the peace he's been stating as his objective, he's going to have to bring the hammer down on Vladimir. He can call him a friend as he lands as the 2x4 lands in his forehead, but he needs to bring that 2x4 down.
Yes, well, there is some revulsion on my part when a president of ours is using the word friend with a genocidal dictator, but
who also considers us to be its principal adversary, or actually its enemy. Yes.
Yeah. So now one question that has come up, China was referred to earlier. I can't remember if it was John, you or who it was, but as this is playing out, how do you think China is reading it, or what should we be watching in the context of China's relationship with Russia and beyond?
Look, the Chinese foreign minister amazingly said publicly, like 6 or 8 weeks ago, actually to Europeans, that China has an interest in making sure Russia does not lose its war. That is China's game, and there remains a funhouse foreign policy community that thinks that if we waste any resources, make sure Russia loses in Ukraine, that will make it easier for China to take Taiwan, which is exactly wrong. Which is why the leaders of Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan all believe it's critical to make sure Putin loses in Ukraine with strong American support to Ukraine.
I think there's an alternative explanation to the Chinese foreign minister's statement. I think it's in Xi's interest that Putin doesn't lose. It may not be in China's. Xi's under a great amount of political turmoil in China right now, and because the economy is doing badly. And if it's shown that he bit wrong on Putin, it further weakens his position.
Well, there's no question that it was Xi who abandoned the quote unquote peaceful rise. And it was Xi who is associated with quote unquote wolf diplomacy. So you might say that Putin's very clear revisionist agenda is mirrored in a slightly less aggressive form in Xi's national security policy. So this speaks to your point, Herman. So he is vulnerable if that national security policy proves to be a loser for China. And the fastest way to make that clear is making sure Putin, and the least expensive way of making that clear for us is making sure that Putin loses in Ukraine.
Well, one thing, we've talked about is the American people. And Herman has made reference to that. We've got the elections coming up and so forth. And I've said this before. Herman has experienced it out on the road. I assume maybe others have too, that when you speak to audiences outside the Beltway, they generally know what's going on, some of them. But when you bring up the abducted children and you say what is being done with those children, the American people, and I'm talking about MAGNA people as well as others, they're revolted by it. We didn't know about that. We can't stand for that. That's wrong. Well, I think the children is an issue here that needs to be, I hope the administration will use more with the American people, because they are inside of abducted children getting back to their parents. We have one person missing in, well, I'll pick on Cleveland because Herman's calling in from there. Somebody missing there, all of a sudden milk cartons have the pictures on it and so forth. We're talking about thousands and thousands of children. The foundation is about ready to start a program. We've been working on the children's thing for quite some time, of explaining to the public how much the children have not been looked after by the United States, I will say. When you look at the sanctions that have been put on people over the children's issue, Russian people, Russian institutions, we lag behind many other countries in sanctions directed at what has been going on with the children.
But Bob, I totally agree with you, but I want to say one thing. This is easy to fix, and this is what I would suggest. If I were the president of the United States, knowing that his wife has huge amount of fan club on the Hill, remember they tried to rename part of the Kennedy Center after her, if that's the case, then what I would do is recommend that the president of the United States have his wife give a speech to Congress and talk to Congress or testify on the children issue, since she sent that note to Putin. And you have Zelensky's wife who sent her a thank you on that. So frankly, there's a way to do this. And part of it is to have, Mrs. Trump come out there and speak to members of Congress, have a hearing on this issue, and have her speak on this. That would give you a huge amount of MAGA attention to this issue and may drive the point home.
Wow. I just think I've heard from my wife who's downstairs listening to this. This is something that she's been talking about the last few days too. Of course, Nadia and Debra get along very well, so it's not surprising to me that you're pushing this idea, and I hope we all can do that idea because I think that would add to everything we're doing if something like that would happen.
I think we really covered pretty much everything we needed to cover. We should be pleased about what happened yesterday, but careful about what might happen next, and work hard on making the arguments that we made today.
Dan?
As usual, well said by John and Debra. On the issue of children, I like Debra's suggestion. I like pounding this issue all the time. Put the Russians on the defensive. Make them ashamed. That actually may increase the odds that you get children back, right? That Putin does something as a magnanimous gesture because he's a great guy. Keep pounding them, and then get ready to stare down the Russians. That's what it's going to take.
Debra?
Just say to President Trump, be a man.
Herman?
The children issue is powerful because everybody understands that while they don't understand the intricacies of war.
Thank you, everybody. I appreciate it. I appreciate your time, your I'm sure we're all going to be in conversations as we go forward. Stay tuned and have a good day. Bye-bye.